According to James Bond, you only live twice, but I think that everyone dies twice too. Once when your heart stops, and again when your name is spoken for the last time. My name is Brad Argent, and I've set myself the challenge of keeping the dead alive. I'm going to do this by first finding an interesting looking grave and then use all the tools at my disposal to learn about that person's story. I'm going to follow in their footsteps and uncover their amazing personal history, but that's only part of the challenge. Then I'm going to try and track down a living relative of that person in order to tell them everything I've learned. The dead outnumber the living by 10 to 1, so this challenge won't be easy. I'm starting today's challenge in Brixham, South Devon. So let's find a headstone that looks like it might have a story to tell.
Well, look, here. This is a great example of some grave iconography. See the anchor? Now, the anchor can mean a whole bunch of different things. It could be a connection to the sea, but often the anchor will represent connection to faith. My faith is anchored in the Lord. Yeah, but apart from the anchor, I don't see anything that immediately catches my eye from a story point of view. I'll keep looking. Well, you don't see this very often. Now, in a cemetery full of very big headstones, we have this almost lost in the vegetation. It's this lovely little book, and it's so quaint compared to all the other big headstones around here. I'm going to keep looking. Ooh, what is that? How do I get to that? That's the Angel of Victory. You see, she has the sword and was clearly clutching something that's now gone. After the sword of pain, the crown of peace. It says, in memory of our beloved son, Sidney Hannaford Helia, wounded at the Battle of Ypres on the 28th of April, died at Boulogne on the 8th of May, 1915. Sidney is missing his crown of peace. I think we need to give it back to him.
This headstone looks like it has some history to reveal, so I'm going to take this on, tell Sidney's story, and find one of his relatives. A quick check online tells me that inside the church there's actually a stained glass window dedicated to him. I wonder if that'll give me any clues as to who this man was and how I can find his relatives.
My eye is immediately drawn to this large panel here, just on the left, with what I'm going to assume is Sidney Helia in it. I mean, he's dressed in a First World War uniform. I mean, there is so much going on in this window. Now, what am I getting from this? Well, remember when we looked at the statue that was on Sidney's grave, we saw the inscription that talked about the sword of pain. I can see here Alfred the Great holding a sword. This is the sword of pain. And then to the right, we have this Christ-like figure holding the crown of life, or if you like, the crown of peace, because we can see the doves at his feet. This is a direct allegorical reference back to Sidney's grave, to the monument that sits atop. And I just noticed that right there, in the middle of Sidney's portrait, that I'm almost certain that's the cloth hall in Ypres. In 1923, when this window was put in place, the cloth hall would have looked nothing like that. They would have maybe started thinking about rebuilding it, but it was essentially a pile of rubble. And the fact that it is represented here complete restored, rebuilt, it's a sign of hope. It's a signifier that the sacrifice that Sydney made and so many others like him made was not in vain. We can rebuild, we can recover.
Seeing that Yeats features so heavily in Sydney's story, I think we'd better go there first to understand what he went through, and maybe being there will assist me in finding one of his relatives. This journey has given me some time to do some research on Sydney Helia. It turns out he wasn't born in Brixham, but in Hull. He and his brothers owned a fishing trawler company, and when the war started, he immediately volunteered to join the 4th East Yorkshire Regiment, and on the 24th of April 1915, he went into battle, serving as a 2nd lieutenant. Sydney's war diary tells us about the awful experiences he had. He wrote, "When the high explosive shells strike, they dive into the earth and the end of the world seems to come." But his war diary also tells us something else. It tells us exactly where he was when he became a victim of one of those shells.
This idyllic Belgian countryside was where Sydney was in 1915. And it looks peaceful now, but back then it would have been chaos. The ground was churned up, there were trenches everywhere, there were bodies everywhere, there was men, there was equipment, there was noise, there was smell, and there was death. Just behind me here, as Sydney and his men were digging in to face the enemy, a shrapnel shell struck right in the middle of them. 4 of them were killed instantly, and 8 of them were wounded. And of course, one of those was Sydney Hannaford Helia. His injuries were extensive. To get a sense of the measure of the man, when we read the first-hand accounts of what happened, he had lost his left arm at the shoulder. He'd taken shrapnel to the legs, to the buttock, to the face. He would not allow the medics to attend to him until they had attended to the rest of his company. He left himself in a very vulnerable, very exposed position until he was the last one to be attended to and taken off to the clearing hospital.
When he was placed on the stretcher, it was so dark that the stretcher bearers got lost, and it took him 2 days to get to the clearing hospital. So we're now on our way to Boulogne, because we know from the records that's where he was sent. So we're trying to recreate his steps. But what we don't know is exactly where the number 7 stationary hospital was. So it's time to do a bit of research.
So the war diary tells me that the number 7 stationary hospital was in a school named after Henri Martin. And I'm here in Rue Henri Martin, looking at these buildings, hoping that one of them is a school. This, I think this is it. And this is where Sydney came. He passed through this archway here, but on the 8th of May, 1915, Sydney died. And taking a closer look at the records, we found something remarkable. There, in the Roll of Honour, as almost a throwaway statement, was the fact that Sydney was visited by his father, Charles, and his brothers whilst he was here. And they would have left here full of hope. But of course, Sydney passed not long after they left. But this gives me hope. I now have a name, Charles Helia. I know he had brothers. I can now start building a family tree, and I can now find living relatives. So I'm going to build this family tree right now. And when I do that, I'll get a sense of just who it is that we can go and talk to about Sydney. Will we be telling them something new, or will they be telling us something? So let's start with Charles. Charles was married twice. Once to Susan. Now, Susan died in 1885, and Charles married quite quickly after that. And he married a woman called Jane. Now, Jane's surname was Hannaford, which of course is Sydney's middle name. But it wasn't just Sydney, but he had two siblings. Marjorie, who married Henry, and Reginald. Now, they had two children, two boys. Henry, so Henry Mackerel, and Ian Rollo Mackerel. Ian, he married Jean, and they had four children. Martin was born in 1962. Martin Mackerel, he's the person that we want to speak to. He is Sydney's great nephew. Now, Martin, he's in the Isle of Wight, just over there. I think we need to go and pay Martin a visit.